Hello, my loves. Welcome back to Love, Sex, and Magic. I am so excited for today's guest. We have Dr. Nicole LePera on today's show, also known as the holistic psychologist. I'm sure you follow her account on Instagram. It's extremely popular. So Dr. Nicole was trained in clinical psychology at Cornell University and the New School for Social Research. She also studied at the Philadelphia School of Psychoanalysis. As a clinical psychologist in private practice, Dr. Nicole often found herself frustrated by the limitations of traditional psychotherapy. Wanting more for her patients and for herself, she began a journey to develop a united philosophy of mental, physical, and spiritual health that equips people with the tools necessary to heal themselves. She is the creator of the Self-Healers movement, where people from around the world are joining together in community to take healing into their own hands. Her new book, How to Do the Work, is currently available and is a New York Times #1 bestseller. So in this conversation, we dive into just a whole host of topics in the book. We talk about trauma, we talk about relationships, betrayal, attachment styles, and how we can really start to break the patterns and change the world, really, is what we're talking about. So I'm so excited for this episode. Let's welcome Dr. Nicole. Dr. Nicole, welcome to the show. I'm so grateful and honored to have you here.
I'm so honored to be here, Mel. Thank you.
Wow. Where do we begin? You are just such an incredible force in this world, and your new book, How to Do the Work, which I have my copy of right here, which was shipped out to Costa Rica via Miami. It's very hard to get things delivered here, by the way. So it was very special to receive this. And I've been diving in. It's so good. And it's so thorough. Just like everything that you do and everything you share, it's so in depth. So this book, I think it went straight to #1 on the New York Times bestseller list, right? You just must be so proud of the work that you're doing in the world. How has this been feeling for you this last few months?
The last few months have been, I think, all of the feels really, Mel. It's been quite an overwhelming experience from start to finish. Eternally grateful having the opportunity to put this much more comprehensive work into the world. After I created the Instagram account, 2.5 years ago now, I really began to understand, obviously, the value point of Instagram, equalizing access, being able to begin in some of these conversations, talking about some of these concepts of healing, which will continue to do on social media. Though I was very aware of the need for a comprehensive piece. What is holistic psychology? How do we heal in a holistic human way? So for me, having the opportunity quite early on to be offered the book contract was incredibly, incredibly overwhelming, and appreciate it. And then the whole process of writing the book really brought up a lot for me. Throughout the book, I talk about my own past, my own healing journey. I think anytime we go down those pathways, it can be quite an emotional experience. And then, of course, there's the birth of the book out into the world, my story living amongst all of the thousands of people who have it, which was quite overwhelming. So on the other side of it, beginning to restabilize myself, because part of what I do is when I get quite busy, I don't check in with myself. So hearing people ask, how is it feeling? A big honest answer of mine is I don't really fully know yet. And I'm in the process now of regrounding myself, tuning into how I feel, though. Like I was saying before we hit play or hit record, pride definitely is up there as one of the feelings that I'm sure I'll settle into more and more as the weeks evolve.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing and owning that as well. One of the things that I was hoping to get from this book, which you've definitely delivered on, is more of your personal story, because you provide so much value for others on your Instagram, so much healing, so much help for everyone. And I was really wanting to understand more about your personal story and how this became such a passion and your mission. So can you share a little bit more about what was going on personally for you in this life, what was your awakening to all of this?
Absolutely. My entry into Instagram world, actually, one of my main intentions that I often cite was to have a place. I wouldn't have necessarily imagined it to be a platform at that time. I had no idea who was going to care to hear my story. But for me, I was at the point of my healing journey, which I'll go back in time in a minute, though sharing my story, sharing my truth was a really big intention of mine. Because up until that point, I'd come to realize a lot of the habits and patterns that I was repeating on the daily that weren't serving me. One of the main being, I didn't really speak my truth. I didn't know my truth, let alone be able to share it with the world. So hearing that it's translating, seeing that it began to translate so universally on that account, for me was really affirming. And like I said, it was very much an aspect of my own healing journey. So thinking back in time, as long as I can remember, I was always very, very curious about people, about what made people appear similar to me and their being in the world. And of course, what made them dissimilar to me. So from that point of curiosity, you would have heard me begin to speak probably in high school about wanting to be a psychologist when I grew up, with the intention being, right, create the self-awareness. I was interested in understanding myself and of course in imparting those tools to others. So flash forward in time, I'll save all of the schooling that I went through, all of the training, all of the tools that I gathered in these academic settings, beginning to practice in all different types of community-based organizations, inpatient, outpatient. Finally, I had my degree, I had my license, and I opened up a practice. Several years in, instead of feeling, empowered and fulfilled as I imagined I would feel, this is all I've wanted to do, and now I'm in this position. My practice was quite successful early on, and like I said, I felt I was very equipped. I learned a lot of different integrative ways to work with humans. Yet, what I continued to witness week after week was actually not empowerment, not change, not understanding. Well, I should reframe that. It was increased understanding. I had humans now week after week that were having so much self-awareness, yet what I continued to witness is an inability to bridge that gap, as I call it, between insight and action. And for what I felt and experienced in those rooms and in my own life, continuing to watch myself, unable to use my insight to translate into change, I began to feel really disempowered right along with my clients. And of course, in my personal life, my symptoms of lifelong anxiety were still there. I had some physical symptoms that began to pile up. And I was first confused and curious. So from a point of exploration, I really dove in to begin to understand why. Why are all of us unable to create change or maintain change, even if we have began to make some efforts into that direction? And what I began to understand is the need for a much more holistic way that we're working and honoring really of the power of the subconscious mind, the space from which most of us are living our day to day. So that was when I took a really hard pivot, began to formulate my theory of holistic wellness that you now meet in the pages of this book. But of course, I brought to Instagram, like I shared earlier, first as my first outlet of beginning to share this new awareness with the world.
Yeah, beautiful. And it really feels as though you are really at the forefront, pioneering a new way of helping people look at themselves, and not just kind of all normal people, should I say, but also you're really like a pioneer for a lot of professionals, coaches, therapists, psychologists, psychotherapists. And one of the first things I read in your book that really stood out to me was this old idea that we've kind of all grown up with, that it's all about genetics. Genetics are our destiny. If something happens, it's because of our genes, and we kind of go along thinking, this is who I am. This is who it runs in my family. And you're really breaking that down and offering people a whole new way of looking at that. Can you talk into that?
Absolutely. And what you're describing is really what the medical and psychological field has been built on for so long, which is a medical theory of what we call genetic determinism, which is just that. The genes that I am born with will determine my fate in life, whether it's the physical, medical conditions I will develop or not develop, or the psychological. Some of us go as so far as say my personality, how I am in the world, are all determined by my genetic constitutes. So that's problematic in my opinion. And I believe that to be true myself, because what's difficult in that space is we really don't feel, many of us don't have an ability to create change, right? If these genetics or I I had no control over. I cannot really choose my parents and what genetics they have. So a lot of us can begin to feel very hopeless and helpless, and as healing is not in our future. Um, when I dove into research and trying to understand, first and foremost, why so many people, right, were beginning to struggle with medical diagnoses in addition to psychological, I began to realize, and I learned of a whole new science, a science that we now call epigenetics, which definitely honors our genetic components, our DNA, because we all are born with that. But it really now highlights the importance of our daily choices, of our lifestyle, of the environment in particular, really honoring that our genes interact with our environment. And that usually is how genes become expressed. We get those diagnoses or those symptoms, or we don't. Well, now here's the point of confusion, because I'm sure a lot of us listening see similar patterns in our families. It's very understandable to agree, well, yeah, because we're all genetically related. My mom has heart disease, I have heart issues, right? My mom has anxiety, I have anxiety. All, even personality wise, a lot of these traits and characteristics really do hang together in our families. So, like I said, I very much believe that genetically I was limited because I saw my family being limited. So you'll hear me talk about epigenetics, and you'll also hear me honoring how important the specific environment of our family is, and how much modeling happens in our family, and how much what I call conditioning happens in our family. And it's the conditioning that leads to those similarities, not the genetics. Though, like I said, it's very confusing. I very much internalized that belief that I can't change. And it took me a while to peel back those onions to begin to create change and to begin to challenge that and really honor that epigenetics is the science, and that we have much more control than we once thought we had.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. When you talk about, the family, the conditioning around the family, there was a part of your book where I read you share that you would have fought, tooth and nail that you had the perfect childhood. And I really resonated with that, because when I used to hear people talk about childhood trauma, I would be like, well, I don't have any. Not me. Like, my childhood was great. And a part that I really love in the book is you break down these six different archetypes of childhood trauma that's very different than, severe neglect, abuse. Mm-hmm. And you go into depth in these in the book and how this might show up in your adult life. Are those something that you can go into now, just briefly?
Yeah, so for a very long time, we realized that events, big catastrophic events, big T traumas, as it's been commonly known in the field, those moments of abuse, physical, sexual neglect, it took us till the 90s actually to begin to research how we do carry effects of those big, bad, big T traumas. If they happen even in childhood, we can carry the effects into our adulthood. Those of us that had the big T trauma see increased rates of medical diagnoses, psychological, amongst many other things. Right. So again, here's another point of confusion for me. I took the scale that really determines how many of those big bad events we have, is commonly known as the ACEs scale, Adverse Childhood Experiences. So when I met this, looking back in my childhood, I suspected that none of those bad things happened. I took the test and I came up with a 1, very low score out of, I think it's 10, which simply says that nothing bad happened. So more or less, I should be okay. And again, this was a point of confusion, maybe even shame for me, because what I began to see after working years upon years with people who had upwards of 10 in that ACEs score, I saw the same coping mechanisms, the same habits and patterns in myself that I saw in them. And I began to wonder, how could that be? If I'm perfectly honest, for a bit of time, I began to explore, could I have a repressed memory of some big bad thing that I just can't, place right now? And what I came to realize, Mel, is that trauma and what I attempt to advocate for in the book is that trauma isn't necessarily, something, a determinant we want to place on the event, right? An event, it isn't about the threshold that an event passes. It's more about the human experience in the event. How capable is that human to tolerate and to deal with the stress of that event? And here's now where we can insert an incredible amount of individual variation, right? Honoring that some events that maybe don't reach that threshold of big T might still be just as overwhelming to the person who doesn't have the supportive emotional environment to help them regulate. Because something that we all need in childhood as a human are relationships. They're actually quite literally what keeps us alive in infancy, because as an infant, we can't meet our, at least initially, our physical needs alone. So we're all wired to connect. And if we don't have safe spaces to regulate literally our nervous system in those moments of stress, the same overwhelm can happen, resulting in those same adaptations or those coping mechanisms, which why then flash forward in time, whether you have the 10 or the 1 on the ACEs scale, life still looks very similar to you. So in the book, I really advocate for removing that label from the event itself and really beginning to understand why someone might have been overwhelmed by events that might not have, surpassed that threshold, honoring individual difference in stress and resilience and their individual genetic makeups, right? That help some of us tolerate stress better than others.
Beautiful. Love that. Yeah. Some of the things that you share in the book, that maybe people wouldn't necessarily associate as a big deal. We're probably going to, I think throughout this book, people are going to just be constantly recognizing themselves, and going, oh my God, that was me. Oh my God, that's me as well. Having a parent that vicariously lives through you or unconsciously molds or shapes you, having a parent that doesn't model boundaries, having a parent who's focused on appearance, having a parent who can't regulate their emotions. Like, I feel as though most parents fit into these categories. I feel like it's pretty rare for someone to have grown up with a super healthy mum and dad with secure attachment styles, healthy boundaries, not projecting their own stuff. I think what I want to ask you is, what advice do you have for people that are kind of just reading all of these things and just finding more and more things that they need to be fixed, I suppose? Like, where do you draw the line between like just constantly doing all of this work and the person that's like never going to be finished with that because it's a lifelong journey?
I first want to, I think, normalize the humanity in all of this, which is that you're right, Mal. We are all raised by humans who were raised by other humans, right? So we are limited by that which was modeled to us by the tools that we've gathered over our lifetime. And now, while I can't relate to how it is to have a child because I don't have one, I don't plan to have one, though, right, should I have a child, I would be then limited to model whatever I've accumulated by this time in my adulthood, right? So we are limited. And I see a lot of times my work getting misinterpreted with this idea that I like to catch everyone in this trauma, in this trauma category to sell them product or to, kind of minimize the humanity in all this, that life is difficult. I think actually we need to honor that there is stresses that a lot of us are dealing with on the daily basis that can continue to compromise us because, again, we're humans raised by humans. And if we look back, so many of us, if we have awareness of our lineages or the generations that came before us, we can see a lot of trauma, right? And a lot of the impact of those environments that are still remnants in our family, even those well-intentioned caregivers that so many of us have that are consciously, right, attempting to prevent us from experiencing that same pain. Sometimes we overcompensate as parents in the other direction. So we all carry the wounding with us. We all carry the effects, even if we don't want to call it wounding. We all carry the effects of our childhood. So just to clarify, the work isn't about, and I see this concept often misunderstood, isn't about endlessly living in my analytic mind, endlessly evaluating every aspect of my life and wondering where it came from and thinking it's bad and changing it. Healing, in my opinion, is actually about not living in our mind at all. Because living in our thinking mind, in my opinion, is another defense against a deeper trauma, some dysregulation in the body or some discomfort. It's a distraction. So we don't actually want to live a life where we're endlessly analytical, is a word that I often hear, right? Always thinking, always analyzing to heal. Healing happens when we're fully conscious, when we're actually not in that space at all, and when we're living fully consciously outside of that subconscious region that contains all of those habits and patterns.
Beautiful. I'm so happy that you shared that because I think in this industry, self-help, self-improvement psychology, there is that tendency to like just constantly be finding new things to heal and constantly be finding ways in which we're broken and ways in which, unpacking and unpicking our traumas. And yeah, you're right. And I think I've probably got a lot of mums and maybe some dads listening as well who are probably a little worried about, projecting unconsciously their unresolved trauma and wounding and pain onto their kids, and really wanting to raise self-aware, emotionally available children, and validating their experiences. Do you have like any best practices or advice for parents of young children?
Absolutely. Whenever I get any version of this question, Mel, coming again from a very well-intentioned space, conscious parents out there, right? How do I break these patterns for my child? How do I show them differently? My answer is always some version of the same, which is by not actually focusing on your child, by focusing on your own healing journey, right? That's how we become aware of what we might be, to right, use this concept, projecting on someone else, or how our past might be affecting how we're holding space or not holding space for our child's emotion in that moment. The actual work begins when, as a parent, even we begin to look at ourselves. And I know this, can be quite criticized in terms of this idea of a lot of us begin to believe, or have been cultured to believe, that self-work is selfish, that we have to show up fully in service of another human, especially if and when that human is our child. And I think this idea of self-care being merged with this concept of selfish is quite, and I, in my family, have been modeled that myself. So for me, it was really difficult to break that habit of always feeling selfish for caring for the self. Because in reality, the only way that we can fully show up as a whole human in our own state of equilibrium, to be able to be that point of co-regulation, say for our child, is to be in that state ourselves, is to have regulated ourselves as the parent. So my statement to all caregivers out there listening is that parenting is hard, right? And the work is more about uncovering your own wounding so that you can begin to heal, and over time model a new way of being, perhaps even a new relationship with your children. Also honoring the resilience of children, right? A lot of times we want to protect our children, go heal in a closet and not tell them that mommy's sad or mommy's going through something, or daddy. In reality, our children feel that. So we think we're hiding a lot more than we really are. So here's a beautiful moment to be honest, right? As you evolve as a parent or a caregiver, honesty, transparency, and healing, in my opinion, can be the most impactful thing, because all of us humans, even into adulthood, are incredibly resilient. Many of us need to rebuild that resiliency. So showing children evolving as a parent, and then obviously gifting our child with a different experience of us, actually is resilience building, in my opinion.
Wow. Yeah, that's beautiful. I completely agree with that. So moving on slightly, there's a line in your book that I highlighted, and it's about self-betrayal. And you write, few of us know who we really are, yet we want others to see through all of our layers of self-betrayal and into our core selves. I'd love if you could speak a little bit about self-betrayal and how that tends to show up in our lives.
Self-betrayal, or the actioning around self-betrayal. Self-betrayal is an action, again, lives in this subconscious that we keep kind of wrapping around to speak about. In self-betrayal is the action of showing up more often than not in our conditioned self, which for many of us is not attentive to our own individual physical, emotional, or spiritual needs. And again, all of these habits and patterns that many of us are cycling through began in childhood, perhaps where we were in an environment or not modeled how to recognize and honor those needs. Though because we become very patterned and we rely on that autopilot, we'll call it, throughout our life, the more we cycle through that autopilot, the more we're not showing up in service of ourself. We're showing up in self-betrayal, right? We're doing all of those adaptations, all of the things that we did at one time because that was the only option we had. Meanwhile, we're not honoring our needs. We're not recognizing our needs. We're not allowing ourselves space to self-express. So again, self-betrayal often comes as a result of living in autopilot, which honors the reality that in many of our autopilots are habits and patterns that don't fully serve our body's physical, spiritual, or emotional needs.
Mm, mm. And how would that tend to affect, let's say, a romantic relationship?
In multiple ways, right? Oftentimes, so many of us have that habit of outsourcing, right? We have developed the habit of looking to people or partners to meet our body's needs, to meet our emotional needs, not really playing a role in that ourselves. And again, that for many of us is a habit and pattern that began in childhood. A universal habit and pattern that began in childhood that we're all living within are our relational patterns. Those, like we were talking about earlier, those earliest relationships were our blueprint for how we relate to others. Though those of us who were grown in stressful environments, who didn't have maybe emotionally attuned parents to help us cope with our own emotional needs, what many of us begin to do is modify ourselves. Here's where we begin to play the roles, as I talk about in my book, the archetypes. We wear the masks. We become the helper, the caretaker, right? The overachiever. We begin to play a role in relationships as our best attempt at continuing to have our needs met. But again, for many of us, that role is maybe only honoring part of ourself. It's not honoring our full self. And then that blueprint becomes how we relate to others in life. It becomes our familiar. So quite quickly, we're the little girl who's the overachiever like myself, or the caretaker. And then we become the adult who's still functioning in those patterns, leading to further self-betrayal, because I'm showing up, right, with my mask on, fully in service perhaps of someone else. Meanwhile, all of my needs have been accumulated over time, being unmet. And then the most problematic consequence of this that I myself have lived is resentment about the other, is pointing the fingers at the people we're in relationship with, wondering why they're A, not meeting our needs, and B, considering that maybe someone else would or could. Not really honoring. So back to that quote you read, not honoring that we actually haven't made space for our needs to even give anyone an opportunity, right, to show up in service of them. So another way the work begins within. So important takeaway, the habits and the modeled relationships, how we show up in our relationships really for many of us begins in childhood, usually in service of getting our needs met. Oftentimes, though, right, repressing or suppressing some aspect of our physical, emotional, or spiritual selves. Again, a pattern we continue to replicate, further continuing to self-betray and not meet our needs into adulthood. Yet we continue to look for someone else to help us or to know what we need, not really looking within.
Yeah, wow. I feel as though people are probably going to need to listen to this episode a few times because there's just so many light bulbs and things just going off. Even for me, I'm like, oh, yeah, like things are making sense even more now. So, something that I wanted to ask you about is these primary relationships that we have with our caregivers in childhood that obviously affect all of our relationships in adult life. Let's say someone goes on this path of healing and they're wanting to heal their mother wound, heal their father wound so that they can have healthier relationships. If they've had let's say they've had a lot of pain caused to them by one of these parental figures and they see that it's causing them pain later in their life, in their adult relationships. How important is it for people to actually heal the relationship with that person in the present? If let's say it's a father figure, their father is still around, there's a lot of pain and hurt there. Is it a case of it's good to heal those primary relationships actually with that person? Or is it like, do you know what? Do it all by yourself and there's no need to actually involve them in, where do you draw the line between like, it's good to have healthy relationships with these people and heal those relationships, or this person wasn't good for me, it's actually self-love to not have that person in my life?
So those of us, right, that have the opportunities or feel safe enough, right, to begin to rebuild or create or heal, as we're using the language around those maybe core relationships where it all began, right? For some of us, that is part of the journey. For others, it isn't. We don't have those people in our life, or they are just too unsafe to continue to have in our life. So we maintain a boundary of distance, of no contact even, or anywhere in between. So the important, I get this question a lot in terms of those of us who too maybe struggle to have a full memory of our childhood, or maybe aren't sure of where some of these things came from. I often get asked a similar version of this, which is, do I have to go back in time, right? Do I have to go through hypnosis and pull up the thing that it was? So the answer is the same, which is no, not necessarily. Because chances are you're still living from those autopiloted adaptations that came from that wounding. So those of us who don't feel safe enough to heal within those core relationships, or don't have access to those people anymore, can begin to heal in the current relationships we're a part in, because chances are we're still replicating those old habits and patterns, and we can begin to create change in this new current relationship. So healing can happen at any time. Same goes for, you don't have to go through hypnosis to unearth the problematic memory or memories that caused it. Chances are you're cycling through those coping skills or tools right now in the day to day, and we can begin to create change and heal moving forward as opposed to going back.
Beautiful. And that kind of leads nicely into my next question, which is, if someone is listening and they've kind of just stumbled upon your work, or, just picked up your book, and what you do, Nicole, is just so, your body of work is so vast. You're basically teaching people how to understand themselves and how to understand everyone around them. If someone is brand new to this and, really wants step one, or let's say they want to bring a partner into this and it's just all very overwhelming, and it's like, where do we even freaking begin? There's so much to dive into here. What is like a kind of first step for someone like that?
Whomever you are, whatever someone you are out there listening, the first step is always going to be building, many of us rebuilding, a new foundation of living consciously, of being able to evidence or witness for ourselves the power of that autopilot, those habits and patterns that just take over the moment my eyes open in any given morning, right? Understanding that when we're firing from that space, we're reacting, we're allowing those habits and patterns to continue to dictate what happens now. So the foundation to create change, which originates in a new choice, happens on alliteration when we create consciousness in our day to day. Consciousness actually comes from a different part of our brain. We're actually now talking about neuroplasticity and beginning to fire up new neurons. And for many of us, new areas of our brain that might be lying dormant, because so many of us are living from that autopilot day to day. So I go as far to say that pretty much any human that's having this conscious experience here on earth could benefit from cultivating this consciousness habit. Because within that choice, right, as we begin to experience life more consciously, we can become present to those older habits and patterns. We can see, right, those daily things that we do, whether, again, it's tending to our physical bodies. We can see the habits and patterns we have around our emotions, the thing we always do when we feel mad, right? We can begin to see how repetitive we are. Those of us that want to pull back the onion a little more can turn their focus inward and begin to consciously view their thoughts. And here's where it gets really complicated. We get to see the endless chatter that is coming from our thinking mind, that is often, again, driven in older stories that were very much based out of real experiences, though that continue to color our day to day. So when we become conscious, we gift ourselves with, like I said, not only the ability to create choice, to see, right, to see everything that we're talking about, to see the power of this subconscious, and then within that space of choice, to begin to make changes, to make new choices. While they will be uncomfortable because they will be unfamiliar, yet those new choices will actually lead us to the future that's different than that past that so many of us are cycling through.
Wow. Yeah, it's truly so powerful. And this book, like I can't stress enough, everyone listening, if you don't already have a copy of the book, definitely get it. And it's hefty, it's deep, like it's very thorough. You're not going to fly through it. You're going to be reading and rereading and highlighting and taking notes. It's like, it's kind of like a life program, I would say, that's timeless. So Dr. Nicole, what would you say your wish is for everyone that picks up a copy of your book? What would you like to happen for them?
Well, first and foremost, Mel, I'm smiling very huge because that was my intention. I knew this wasn't going to be a quick book that people blow through. My hope was that it wasn't, that this was a living, breathing work that can go with people as they continue to evolve and change. And quick little aside, my sister reported to me a week or two ago, shared with me, I should say, that she was feeling an intense amount of guilt because she has yet to finish the full book. She's up to chapter 8 or 10 or something around there. And long story short, she was feeling so badly because she's like, "Oh, I'm her sister. I should read her book." And I had to affirm to her, "Suzanne, this, of course, you're not through the book. This is a deep book for any human reading it, let alone the fact that you're kind of a character in the book. So for a lot of us, this will be a meaty work that takes time to go through it." So hearing you say that is everything to me. My hope with all my work, honestly, Mel, is that someone picks up this book or even just meets an Instagram square. You don't even have to go as far to buy the book. I put similar content out every day on my Instagram, on my YouTube. My hope is for anyone meeting my work that they empower themselves to create change in their world, whatever that looks like for them, showing up differently in their relationships, reconnecting with their own intuitive knowing within so that they can begin to live in their own full self-expression or whatever it is. The change that that person will create, to me, is the most meaningful part of the work that I do and is the reason why I show up. What will you go and now do in the world? Because I very intentionally ended the book. The final chapter is entitled Interdependence. And it's how we, in my opinion, begin to create the collective change that many of us know we now need in our societies around the world. In my opinion, the way that we do that is by showing up differently as individuals, because the individual is a relational creature. So as we begin to show up differently in our worlds, in my opinion, the world begins to change around us. So my hope for the book or any version of my work that you meet is you go change your little world or your macro world. Go change and the world changes.
And that's why I'm just so happy for you that the book has had the success that it's having, because this is literally how we are going to change the world. Our individual healing is our collective healing. So this is the exact kind of thing that everyone needs. And another thing that I love about your work, Nicole, and this book in particular is, you don't have to go through the whole thing in order. Like someone could see one of your Instagram posts, let's say on avoidant attachment, and they can pick up the book and they can flick to that part and they can go, "Oh, I want to read more about that. I'm going to dive into that chapter today." So I really love that about it. It really is this kind of encyclopedic Bible for people's life and understanding themselves.
I'm so glad. And I was very intentional too, talking about kind of bringing this beautifully full circle, right? That bridge from insight into action. I made it a point not to just talk about these as concepts. I made it a point at the end of each chapter to give those action plans, to give now the steps with how to utilize and begin to integrate this concept or this action verb into an action. So at the end of each chapter, which you can absolutely, like you're speaking very beautifully, go in, right? And just begin to do the work that resonates with you. You can also utilize the exercises at the end of the chapter to begin to actually practically apply that work. Because that's why the book is entitled How to Do the Work. That's why I'm always focusing on the daily action of change, because I'm very aware now, after many years of thinking that thought alone would shift and change my life in some macro way, that the real work is the changing, the embodying these new choices and new responses each and every day. So again, at the end of each chapter, you can begin to utilize those action plans, begin to make the space for those new choices that will allow you to actually create that future.
Yeah, beautiful. And there's some really great exercises at the end of every chapter for people to really dive deep in their own time. So, Nicole, I have 3 more personal questions that we ask every guest on love, sex, and magic. The first is, what is one thing that you are loving right now?
I am loving having a little bit more free time in my schedule, being able to go back to a little more grounded existence. I can't get enough of that. So right now, regaining balance is what I'm loving.
Yeah, I can imagine things have been a little hectic recently. So I'm glad to hear that. What is one thing that turns you on?
Consciousness, being present to life in all of its glory and in all of its difficulty. And I speak this after coming to the awareness that I was living my life in an incredible state of disconnection. So for me, being consciously present to whatever life is offering me or gifting me with in the moment at hand is a really big turn on, because I used to not feel anything. And in my opinion, that's one of the most difficult spaces to inhabit as a human being, because as complicated as they are, feelings are part of this journey here.
Yeah, I love that. I feel like I couldn't have predicted a more perfect answer for you for that question. And then finally, when was the last time that you experienced magic?
Oh, when's the last time I experienced magic? Probably last time I was in nature. I'm very grateful that I have the opportunity to live by the beach. The ocean brings me a lot of magic. Magic to me, again, is being in that pure state of connection. And typically when I feel connected to the environment in which I'm in is magical. And for me, nature has always been that go-to place. The vastness, I think, as a lot of us experience nature being, has always been that kind of really magical, awe-inducing place for me.
Beautiful. Well, please tell everyone where they can come and find you, hang out with you, get a copy of your book, work with you, join your community, all the things.
All the things. So you can come over and join all of us self-healers where it all started on the Instagram account, the.holistic.psychologist. So the second intention, I know I mentioned earlier, my first intention of creating that account was speaking my truth. Close second intention was connecting with other humans who are living in their own truth, who are, whether you are on the personal side or the practitioner side, we have a many of both in the community. I was feeling lonely and desiring of more authentic connection. So I'm always shouting out that Instagram, because we've cultivated an amazing community of self-healers out there that are walking their own journeys of healing all around the world. So definitely come visit us, the.holistic.psychologist. New podcast. We're actually releasing our first episode, which is a read along with the book. We'll be offering a master class for how to do the work, diving into the preface, being released this Sunday at noon Pacific Standard Time. It is called Self-Healers Soundboard. So a new podcast that has some book-related resources. So anyone out there reading the book or not, you can just read along with us in that. And also a YouTube, The Holistic Psychologist. And finally, my website, theholisticspsychologist.com, which has all of the information on the healing membership, the Self-Healers Circle.
Beautiful. And congratulations on the podcast. That sounds great. I love the sound of that.
I'm super excited. Yeah. So me and my host, my co-host, Jenna Weekland, will be diving in each week to a chapter, deep diving into the concepts, and really exciting, taking some live questions on air from some call-in people. So anyone who's interested can come over. There is a Instagram page that we'll be rolling out for that as well, so that we'll make sure that we also broadcast the call-in number for anyone who wants to follow along, because we will be doing this for each chapter. So love the opportunity to have the community engagement with that piece as well.
I love that. It sounds absolutely incredible. Well, we're actually about to go into my membership community for some more personal questions. But for everyone else, Nicole, this has just been such a pleasure and such a joy to have you on. Thank you so much for pouring into us all of your wisdom and all of your magic.
Thank you. Thank you, Mel. Thank you, everyone listening. It's truly an honor to share the space here with all of you today.
Take care. So, beloveds, I hope you got so much from that episode. As always, if you want extra bonus time with all of our guests, come and join our membership community, the Goddess Collective, where every single guest records a bonus segment for our paying members. It's so good in there. We've got literally so much juicy content inside the Goddess Collective now, as we've been running it for almost 3 years. So come and join us inside if you want to dive deeper. If you really loved this episode, it would mean so much to me if you shared it on your story, tag me, tag Dr. Nicole, and please make sure you pick up a copy of her book. It is so, so good. I think everyone should get a copy of this book. So, my loves, until next time, I hope that your life and your world is filled with love, sex, and magic.